share out after the meeting. Next slide. So for the main part of this meeting, we ask that your cameras be turned off and your microphones muted. We will be using our cameras later. If you have any questions, please use the chat box, and we will have time throughout the meeting to answer some questions, and sometime at the end. So each section will have a chance to share questions. Next slide. When we get into our breakout rooms, we have some virtual meeting agreements. We would love for everyone to actively participate. Keep your video and mic on whenever possible. If you're having any kind of technical assistance, if you click on the little question icon, we can get you some help, and you'll be notified when our time allotment is almost up and when we'll come back to our next session. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Izor, who will provide some more background behind this training.
Next slide, Jess. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you could join us. I'm Chris Izor. I'm the Director of LCAP Advisory Services. Before we jump in, I wanted to take a moment to just thank Dan and Deanne and Annie and Jess for putting this together and organizing all this information for today's session. In addition, we're extremely grateful to the San Diego County Office of Education for leading out around this work. Some of you have possibly seen some of the information that we're going to share today through other publications. The information comes from San Diego County Office in their original publication around alternative metrics. We've modified it slightly to align with the LCFF priorities that we look forward to sharing with you today. Next slide. So recently, our office and the California Department of Education have released some guidance and considerations around reopening school. It is not lost on us the tremendous challenge districts have planning for reopening school under 3 potentially different scenarios: full distance learning, hybrid distance, or a potential for full reopening. You know, with the school closures and subsequent executive orders, a big change that occurred is that metrics and data that you traditionally capture to inform your planning will not be available in the same ways that they've been in the past. What hasn't changed, though, is the need for data to inform your planning and your decision-making processes. The information shared today hopefully helps you think through these 3 different scenarios and how you might influence your planning efforts. Next slide. So we want to just take a second and give you an opportunity to pause and think a little bit about these 3 reflection questions. First, how are you measuring your current system during this change of structure? How do you know what is working and what is not working, and for whom? That's a critical question, the for whom, because in many situations, something may be working and it might be working for a specific group of students, but that same effort may not be working for others. And then with changes to the current system, how might you set the goals around these LCFF priorities differently? While we don't currently have an LCAP template, we know one is coming, and we're not exactly sure how we're going to go about addressing the metrics, the exact template, the stakeholder engagement process, but beginning to think of the 8 state priorities and how we can gather more local metrics and data is critical for this process. So let's just take a second and think a little bit about these questions, kind of frame our thinking before we move into the rest of these slides. All right, let's jump to the next slide while you still think about those questions.
So I think it's my turn now. Hi, everyone. This is Deanne Walsh, Manager of Assessment and Accountability in the Differentiated Assistance and District Support Unit. And we're excited to be here today to begin this conversation with you, or to continue it as some of us have begun this conversation. But Before we get started, we wanted to take a moment to try to get a basic understanding of where you all are in regards to this concept of alternative metrics. And as Chris kind of framed the conversation, the way we're defining alternative metrics is that in the absence of those traditionally agreed upon metrics that we're used to collecting year to year, what are we going to use to measure the effectiveness of our system? And specifically, as was noted, what's working, what's not working, and for whom. So we feel that this information is critical to determining how we will be reopening our schools in August and September, as whatever that might look like, as well as necessary for transparent communication with our stakeholders, whether that be board, staff, community members, and families. So using this definition of alternative metrics, we just want to get a sense of how often your LEA has been collecting and or analyzing the alternative metrics. So is it frequently? Maybe you're considering how to look at multiple parts of your system differently already. Is it maybe occasionally? Perhaps you're moving through some metrics over to alternative formats such as attendance, but not all. Is it rarely? Maybe a few key pieces of information are being collected, but maybe sporadically or without really any centralized coordination of it. It might be never. Maybe this is your first kind of foray into this conversation, and that's okay as well. Or there's always the option of I don't know. So perhaps you think this work might be happening somewhere in your system, but you haven't been directly a part of it. So if you can just take a few seconds and try to kind of choose the one that best fits your situation. And hit submit. Okay, maybe about 5 more seconds. All right, and Jess, are you able to share those results back to us, or can you read them to us? Oh, there they go. Is everybody able to see that? Hopefully, we're seeing that about the majority of us, 67%, are at the occasionally level. So that's good to help inform us as we begin to have this conversation. And then we have some rarely, and then maybe another quarter of you or so who just aren't sure. Maybe this conversation is happening, maybe it's not, but we're glad that you're here with us today. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So to frame the conversation today of alternative metrics, we'll be looking through the lens, as Chris noted, of the 8 state priorities. This is the framework that we're used to thinking about. We're used to communicating our actions through our LCAP using it. We're used to communicating with our stakeholders using this framework, as well as measuring our progress. So we thought it made the most sense to use this as our framing for today. And for each of the 8 state priorities, we'll be walking through what metrics might look like for this priority within the 3 different reopening scenarios. So what that might look like in a full distance learning situation, what it might look like in a hybrid situation, and what it might look like in a full in-person situation. Please note though, we will not today be directly discussing priorities 9 and 10 of expelled youth and foster youth. But if there are any of our COE colleagues on the call who would like to explore that area, please, by all means, feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to have that conversation. So for example, we'll take one of the priorities, say course access, and we'll think about what does course access look like when we're measuring it in person? What does it look like when we're measuring it in a hybrid? And what does it look like when we're measuring it in a full distance learning scenario? And we've clustered the 3 priority areas into the 3 categories, again, that we're kind of used to thinking about, being conditions of learning, student outcomes, and engagement. And just to kind of provide you with the framework of how we're going to approach this today, following each category, we'll have a chance for some questions and answers. And following each of all 3 categories, then we'll have some time for breakout sessions where we'll be able to engage in a much more in-depth discussion about the metrics themselves, as well as potentially brainstorm any new additional metrics that you may have already locally created that would be good to share. So we will have plenty of time for conversation as well. And then once the first breakout session has been completed, we're going to work to scramble ourselves into new breakout rooms where we'll be able to hear from each room what happened so that we all leave today with kind of a solid understanding of how we might be able to implement some of these alternative metrics so that we can measure our systems during this current time. So I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. So Jess, if you can advance the slides, please. So to begin with, we're going to first take a look at the 3 state priorities that fall under conditions of learning. Priority 1, basic services. Priority 2, implementation of state academic standards. And priority 7, the access to a broad course of study. And as we begin thinking through each of these metrics, I did want to take a moment to note that to expect some fluidity of the metrics themselves. For example, we may have slated attendance as a measure for engagement, whereas locally you might track it as a measure of achievement. And this is very similar to how things show up in our LCAP. There is some fluidity under what priorities we put different measures, and that's okay. There's no right or wrong, and you can simply feel free to move anything to a different priority if it feels like it's better suited there for you. So next slide, please. So to begin thinking about basic services, traditionally, we've viewed this priority from the lens of those basic services, which have included the correct assignment of our teachers, textbook availability, and adequate facilities. And within a full in-person reopening scenario, this would not likely change at all. It's likely to look pretty much exactly the same. Looking at each of the metrics themselves, we can see that correctly assigned teachers is probably one of the metrics, and there will be a few throughout the conversation today, that's not going to vary very much. It's not going to vary whether we're in a full reopening, a hybrid, or a full distance learning model. Either the teacher who is instructing the students has been correctly assigned or not, and so that one will probably remain consistent. In contrast, textbook availability may look very different. In a full in-person model, we're typically looking at books in hands. And so we're kind of used to those Williams compliance of, does every student have a book? And so that would be kind of the full reopening metric that we're accustomed to. In full distance learning, however, this is likely to look very different. We need to measure access to digital materials, which would require devices, internet connectivity, and accessing the online portals that have been selected by the districts. So there might also be a hybrid scenario where you have to think about both. If you have classrooms or in-person classrooms, as well as virtual classrooms happening, it may be that you're paying attention to both our traditional textbook availability metrics, as well as some of these additional devices or internet connectivity or learning application access. And finally, looking at adequate facilities. Again, with full reopening, it's going to look very much the same. However, the hybrid model might look a little different. You may want to consider capturing information regarding additional areas that are being repurposed for primary instruction. So, for example, multi-purpose rooms, outdoor seating, those are all areas that you may be using to ensure that social distancing requirements are being followed. And thus, it may be an important metric to follow and report out to your community. And again, that could be in both a full reopening or a hybrid model to ensure social distancing requirements. It's not likely that this would be a metric that would really be needed within a full distance learning scenario, given that the students are learning from their homes traditionally, but there will be other metrics that you might be paying attention to in regards to engagement, but not the facility itself. And then finally, before we leave this slide, I wanted to note the asterisks that are used to identify metrics that you may want to pay special attention to in regards to disaggregating them by student group to ensure equitable outcomes. So under this priority, we would likely expect that most districts are going to work to try to achieve a 100% rating for correctly assigned teachers and digital devices and internet connectivity. And so for that reason, we didn't really think that an asterisk was needed next to those. But it may be especially important to pay close attention to the fact that once all students do have that technical access, so they have a device and they have internet connectivity, but we want to make sure that they are also actually connecting to the online portals and learning applications that have been chosen for teaching and learning. So that might be an area where we want to pay particular attention to student group breakout. Okay, next slide. So to continue on with the idea of basic services, this next visualization, I guess, paints the picture of what some of this data might look like. So it's okay for us to provide you with examples of the metrics, but how would the information actually be collected? So much more of the how-to. So for digital device and internet connectivity, for both of these, there are several ways you might already be collecting that information, whether it be surveying your families as to what devices they're using. For those that did not have a device, you might be looking at your device distribution lists. You may also have some phone call logs with families who did not respond to the initial survey. So there could be, excuse me, kind of a piecemeal approach to pull together all of the information as to how many students or the percentage of students that have access to these devices and internet. In regards to accessing the portals and the learning applications, very often, I think almost nearly all of those applications have sign-on reports, so that should be easy to pull from the application itself. And here, we're not so much concerned with engagement itself, but just to ensure that the student has access to it so that they've been able to navigate to know how to get into the materials. And then lastly, when looking at areas repurposed for primary instruction, we could consider the ideas of just looking strictly at the number of spaces, or maybe more specifically, the square footage itself that has been added for the use of primary instruction. Might be two ideas there. Okay, a couple more slides and then we'll have time for questions. If you can advance. Oh, thank you, Jess. For both priorities 2 and 7, there was a lot of similarity across the two, and so we've combined them here for that purpose. Traditionally, both have been measured by a self-reflection tool. Although they're different self-reflection tools, we do realize that both of them do have a self-reflection tool in the dashboard. Excuse me, I had to take a sip of water there. And we would expect that those self-reflection tools could continue to be used in all 3 scenarios, that should not impact the use of the tool itself. However, there may be a few additional metrics that you want to attend to or consider within a hybrid or a full distance learning model. And given that there was a lot of concerns that we heard throughout our communities that potentially students were only reviewing previously taught material or remediating during the time while we were sheltering in place, it may be considered, or it may be important for us to consider tracking how much instructional time is actually being spent on remediation, maintaining of current levels of knowledge, or accelerating. So accelerating learning towards the next grade level. And that would help to really communicate to your stakeholders the idea that new learning is taking place during this distance learning model. So that was an idea that we felt could be used to kind of further measure the effectiveness of your distance learning in both the hybrid and the full distance learning model. Okay, next slide. And the way that we could see this potentially being measured is that you would likely need to create some sort of quick survey that teachers could use to self-report the instructional rigor of their courses. And for example, maybe on a weekly basis, teachers report the percentage of time in which their students are engaged in remediation versus reviewing previously taught concepts versus learning new material. So say like 15%, 25%, 50%. If needed, the surveys may need to be anonymous to ensure an honest accounting of the information. We do not want our teachers to feel as though it's evaluative. But in that case, if it is anonymous, you would likely want to have at least grade level being reported so that we could disaggregate at that level. Okay, so I think we're to our first moment of Q&A. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or simply unmute and ask the question out loud. That is fine as well. But we will have significant time during the breakout sessions to really debrief and dig deep. But if there's any clarifying questions that we can answer now, please feel free. Okay, so there is a comment in the chat that logins are important to track, but not the engagement. And yes, let me clarify. So in terms of in a conditions of learning metric, where we're looking at kind of that textbook availability idea, and when we're thinking about measuring students having access to the material, we would be looking at logins. But I think coming up, Annie has some additional information about how you would want to drill kind of deeper into that and think about engagement. So I apologize for the confusion there, that yes, it is important to go beyond just logins, but if you're only kind of thinking about at first, do my students have access? That's what you'd want to be looking at. Okay, not seeing or hearing any more questions. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dan, who's going to walk us through the student outcomes.
Good afternoon. Dan, can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. And thank you, Jess. Dan Mason, Manager of Assessment and Accountability. I'm going to go over the student outcomes priority area, which consists of LCFF priorities numbers 4, which is student achievement, and priority area number 8, which is student outcomes. My section, this is organized in the same way as Deanne's. I do have one extra slide at the beginning, and because of kind of the similarity of these areas, I've combined the example slide at the end. Next. So this is a little messy, but basically what it's here to show you is just how much of the statewide measurements are presumably lost, assuming that there is no 2020 dashboard, which is extremely likely. We don't have guidance yet on what we'll need to include for metrics in the upcoming 1-year LCAP, but we can presume that the verbiage will be something along the lines of locally determined metrics. And not knowing exactly when a couple of these also will show up on DataQuest and in what form, but I did leave them on here. Something I should point out is that obviously, with student achievement, we should already be using local metrics in conjunction with our statewide measures. So some of this might be just magnifying work that you've already been doing. I did want to bring up really quick the idea of summer or COVID slide, because that'll come into our next area. There's differences of opinion about the magnitude of summer learning loss, but overall it's been found that the trends are achievement typically slows or declines over the summer months. The decline is steeper for math and reading, and the proportionality of the loss increases in the upper grades. And so we're thinking with that and what has been called COVID slide, it really makes some of these measures that we will be looking at on the next slide very important for the beginning of next year. Next. So what this slide shows is what we can be looking at are local assessments, and this is both, these are for full in-person and full distance learning. And what you'll see is that the difference is really kind of the delivery system, and also perhaps assumptions made about the tools. But what I have here is local assessments, both universal screener, diagnostic summative, pulled out separately, SBAC interim assessments, and then also included project-based performance assessments. And I'm sorry, that should say project-based performance assessments in both columns there. I did include in the notes, you'll hear the verbiage quite often now, and if you're confused about it all, I included in the notes to the slide the differences and examples of universal screeners versus diagnostic assessments. And I should also say here, I didn't highlight it, but ideally, you are already disaggregating this type of data by student groups. I wanted to also make a plug for, we are working on an assessment considerations and best practices resource guide that we will be releasing early this summer. So more to follow on that. Next slide, please. And so what this highlights again is you'll see these are very similar tools. The first one being, and I'll go into the full distance learning column, frequent reporting of percentages of students making sufficient progress based on digital learning platforms versus periodic aggregate reporting of student progress growth performance from learning platforms. Again, the difference is in the physical environment and perhaps assumptions of students engaging in the learning platforms. The second item here is less frequent and more summary in focus than the first item. And this is like Deanne said, some of these can bleed from one to another. You could look at percentage of instructional time, content per week, focused on remediating learning gaps, maintaining current performance, accelerating learning towards the next grade level expectations. You could look at that here. You could also perhaps look at a student engagement piece here. It's not completely cut and dry. Next. So for priority 8, student outcomes, once again, the dash without our testing in this spring, most likely there won't be a dashboard, and that kind of blows up the college and career indicator. Previously, though, you were required to report elementary districts, which is about half our districts, were required to report local data, which could be something like percentage of students that are at or above standard in mid-year, say, for example, iReady math assessments by grade level. Next. So for student outcomes, what that looks like now, this is similar to student achievement, although you will see in the first row that we just have summative local assessments with leaving out the screener and diagnostic assessments, with the differences being the delivery system. Also include the interim assessments, project-based performance assessments, and periodic aggregate reporting of student progress / growth / performance from learning applications. So it is similar to the student achievement slide, a little more condensed though. Next. And I did want to highlight here too, so these are some possible metrics that you could be looking at. You'll see the first 3 are all percentages at performance levels. Depending on the assessment and how you're used to displaying it, or perhaps if you're looking at a big slide, how you would like to display it. I said performance levels, I didn't specifically say proficient or above. And Deanne and I are happy to be thought partners on this. If you would like to talk at all about how you want to display assessment information. Yeah, and I think that is it for now. We'll talk more about these in the breakout. And so next, please. And I'll take a look at the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to speak up or put something in the chat box.
Hi, Dan. We did have a question in the comments. The question is, are there any non-SBAC assessments that you recommend schools and districts put in place, i.e. NWEA, MAP, STAR, key data systems?
We do not have a vetted list of, let's say, SCCOE recommended assessments, and I have a hard time seeing us getting to that point. If you want to talk offline about pros and cons of a certain assessment or assessments, I mean, and I can say off the bat, NWEA is one of the gold standards, I wouldn't have a problem recommending them. I do have, I can see us get, I can see it getting a bit sticky when we say SCCOE endorsed. And we will be, like I said, providing a resource guide on best practices relatively soon.
Dan, I was just also going to add to that the idea that many of you have been tapped upon to answer a survey for us in the recent weeks where we're gathering information about the assessments that the districts are using. And as soon as we get a chance to kind of go through that data and clean it up, we are planning to share that out with the field so that you can see what one another are using, and maybe something sounds of interest and you can just reach out and have a conversation with another district or two who is using it to find out their experience. So we hope to share that with you shortly as well.
Thank you, Deanne. I completely blanked on that. But yes, we are, the idea there is that you can see who's using what, and if you have questions or if you would like to share practices that you found useful with those assessments, you'll be able to. Okay, so I see a question from Lynn. What's your take on concerns about the reliability of administering formal assessments via remote, so at home? We will provide more information about that in a resource guide. I unofficially, even though this is being recorded, I can say that you know, we will have to, part of this will be about educating both students and parents about what the assessments are for. We probably won't be able to guarantee that an assessment is 100%, I don't want to say foolproof, but you know, that it's completely the student only on their own in a full distance environment. And that and to what degree that is a concern, I think that, you know, there's kind of a variety of responses to that, depending on what you're using it for. Does any of the team have anything they would add to that, or should we wait? and move forward. So hearing none, I think, Jess, we can move to Annie's section.
All right, hi everybody. I'm going to be talking about the engagement area. So LCFF priorities number 3, parent involvement. Priority number 5, pupil engagement, and priority 6, school climate. Next slide, please. So for priority 3, the focus is to ensure that all families of students in preschool through grade 12 are assured culturally appropriately and linguistically accessible supports and resources to be able to take advantage of opportunities to provide input and participate in school planning and decision making. Normally, in the traditionally, we'd have parent meetings, input from parents. They would be attending your ELAC, DLACs, school site council meetings, and those are not available right now to do in person. And so you'll see I did put something in the hybrid model because depending on what current guidance is at the time from the health department, you might be able to have small meetings with no more than 25 people with the appropriate social distancing requirements for parents, and maybe you have multiple meetings where parents can sign up to attend. But in full distance learning, this might look at virtual meetings with options for parents to share feedback, varying forms of communications with families, and I'll go into that more in the next slide, and analytics from your dedicated distance learning resources. The other area is parent support, family resource centers. A lot of schools have those. During this time, that's an area where families can't come on campus. And so looking at referrals to community-based organizations, calls made to families, households, and outreach, and percentage of parents that have been notified regarding student progress. Next slide. So this slide provides a few examples, but I want to go over the difference that I put. There's 2 different lenses to look at. One is parent communication. So parents being part of the decision making. So on committees, as I said before, ELAC, DLAC, school site council, wellness committees, etc. And then we have the outreach. So making sure there's an effort to reach all families to not only have as decision makers, but to also provide them resources so that they become more engaged with the school for their children. And as we know right now with this distance learning, we have some families that are very engaged, but we have some families that there's a big disconnect. And so thinking about how do we get the information around that? How do we engage those families? So for parent communication and feedback, some information that can be collected. And these are ideas. Remember, these are not, you have to do these, or these are the only ways. These are ideas that we wanted to share. So frequency of calls and information to families. So how maybe you have a school messenger or some kind of something that sends out your call. So how often are those going out, and what is the information that's being sent? Number of virtual meetings and attendance rates. You can collect that LEA for the parent meetings, and also school-wide, the meetings and the attendance rates. And then your social media, and I know many districts have a dedicated distance learning page. So the analytics on that, what is the percentage of, what do you see the number of visits to those pages? In regards to parent outreach, looking at number of referrals to community-based organizations that you've given out, number of calls made to households regarding community organizations, percentage or number of parents requesting support for student well-being. Are they reaching out for counseling service or other things? Log of school messengers, number of calls and frequency, and feedback as what is to engaging parents most. And these are just a few. In the breakout session, we'll talk about more ideas around this area. Next slide. Priority 5 is pupil engagement. So this addresses school attendance, chronic absenteeism, middle school and high school dropout rates, and graduation rates. So as we think about pupil engagement, our goal is that our students are experiencing a positive identity in relation to school, and the goal is to have engaging education curriculum and supportive relationships. And barriers to regular school for attendance can be mental health, nutrition, transportation needs. So in our current setting with distance learning, it's how do we track those things? And so for attendance rate, chronic absenteeism, teachers could possibly be tracking the number of students attending their online virtual classes, the access to distance learning frequency, work completion rates. So, you know, are students uploading work to maybe their Google Classroom? What is that looking like? Number of family check-ins from teachers, and are there SEL lessons delivered and the percentage of attendance on those? Graduation rates are going to be the same whether you're in a normal setting or the distance learning. You're still going to be, for students' graduation, you want to be tracking their course requirements. And then middle school, high school dropout rates. So what is the percentage of students that are not connecting to online learning, and how many families are you unable to get in contact with? We also want to look at mobility rates. Are parents sharing change of addresses? What might be put in place for students that are not showing up to the online classes? And then for the no contact via calls, emails, etc., how are we tracking that? How many times we're reaching out and trying to figure out where these families are and how to get them engaged. Next slide. So some ways to track that data: number of students participating in the online virtual classroom. So student participation data, you could look at sign-on data, percentage of uploaded work, supports for students not attending the virtual classroom. So were their school messengers sent out? Were families calling, or were doing either phone or virtual? Is there a certain number of families that need to be reached out to for support, and number of address changes that might have occurred? We also want to look at supports and services provided to our AL students, IEP students, foster youth high needs. So do you have protocols for virtual IEPs? List of teachers with office hours and percentage of students checking into those, and collecting maybe the list of differentiated class schedules. And the goal is to see how we're making students feel connected to school and feeling as though they belong there, even though they're not there physically. We want to make sure that they're still feeling engaged and part of the school community. Next slide. And then priority 6 is our school climate. So this addresses student suspension rates, expulsion rates, and other local measures, including surveys of students, parents, and teachers on the sense of safety and school connectedness. And schools work toward creating a positive school climate, looking at cognitive, social, emotional, and physical needs of each student. So as we're thinking about this, how do we capture that in a virtual environment? And that can be challenging as there's not that face-to-face with students and families. So hopefully these are some ideas to provide some new ways at looking at the data and tracking it as well. And so suspension and expulsion rates, number of students receiving counseling support, number of calls, virtual check-ins with students. That previous, so maybe up until March, you had, there's students that had the high behavior referrals or had a high number of suspensions. So what's being done to follow up with those students to make sure that they are still feeling connected to the school environment. You have your local climate surveys, and so doing an online survey for students, but ensure it's updated for distance learning, and even with families. So doing online, but we do know some families are not able to have access to that. So even possible, like what could you do for a phone survey? Obviously the questions might have to be narrowed down and choices, but is that an option where you could do some kind of phone survey where they answer questions by, with like a 1 means this, a 2 means this, a 3 means so and so. So just really trying to get that information back from families. Next slide. And so in the school climate, we're looking at access to social emotional support. So number of check-ins, caseload monitoring, number of SEL lessons presented, both whole group and individually, particularly looking at the students that might need some extra supports, are students with high behavioral referrals or students that have been suspended frequently, and percentage of students with access to counseling and number of sessions. So I know some districts are still, their counselors are connecting virtually or on the phone with students and keeping track of that data. And then your climate survey, so number of students by grade level, school, district who completed survey, number of staff, and number of parents. We want to monitor how we're providing a supportive environment, engaging students and families, and coming up next steps, and also making sure that our surveys are accessible in multiple language, and trying to find other options besides online to get our parents engaged in those surveys. So now I'm going to take a few moments to see if there's any questions you can put in the chat box, or as Dan said before, please feel free to unmute yourself. So I see there's a question about resources regarding how to review assessments for bias and guidance for educators regarding creating formative assessments without bias. And that's something that our team is discussing right now. And as Dan said, hopefully we'll have some of that information out in the document that around assessments that we'll be sharing. But that's something that we are talking about as a team right now. All right. Well, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. So I'm going to move it over to Dan, who's going to get us all set up for our breakout sessions. Dan.
So we're going to have 2 breakout sessions. We'll have this first one, and then we'll come back together. We'll get scrambled, and we'll have a second one. This first breakout session is divided into 3 rooms around our 3 priority areas: conditions of learning, student outcomes, and engagement. We will be using a relatively new tool called Jamboard for note-taking, idea generation within each room. Please only use your room's board. These are basically, it's like writing digital sticky notes. There is an icon for a sticky note on the left below an arrow. So roughly at about 9 o'clock on your screen, you should see an icon for a sticky note. I should have said before that, at the top of the page, you can navigate from page 1, which will be conditions of learning, to page 2, student outcomes, and page 3, engagement. And Jess has put in case you need it, the link for that in the text. The prompts that we'll be using are here on the right. So of the presented alternative metrics, which ones might you be able to use and how? Which ones might be challenging and why? And what additional metrics might we consider for the different priorities? Annie and Deanne and I will be monitoring each of the breakout sessions around the groups that we presented on. And the prompts and the summary of the priority area metrics will be included on the Jamboard. Is there anything else I need to add? We'll probably take, with our time right now, we'll be in touch on our end, but we'll take 10 to 15 minutes, and really do hope for participation. You can have your video cameras on. Discussion is encouraged. Okay, I had to unmute myself as we come back here. We're going to be breaking out into 3 more rooms. Each room will be scrambled to include individuals from each of the 3 initial groups. You can go back to Jamboard and use it as a reference. Now, for example, in the group that I was in, we didn't really get beyond the first prompt. We could have talked for a while longer, for sure. But if you can just share with others, using this as guidance, but you don't have to follow it exactly. Members from each of the 3 breakout sessions share this 3-2-1, 3 highlights from the group's discussion, 2 key questions and 1 next step. Each if members of each group will be reporting out that way, and then we will be coming back to our larger group. Should I add anything?
I think you got it, Dan.
Okay. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. All right. I think Jess will send us off into the next breakout rooms.
And if not, it'll be one big group share.
Too bad we didn't have more time. There's lots of great conversation happening in all the sessions. This is good learning for us to maybe make our meeting longer next time so we can have more time in our breakouts. But I'm going to have Jess move to the next slide so that we can make sure we finish on time. So thinking about how to keep track of data might be an area that you're looking for ideas, or thinking like, how do we manage everything all in one spot? So we've created we have a screenshot. We created a sample collection form by priority level. It's a Google sheet. And we gave you an example under priority 1. But this is just something if you're struggling on where do we keep all this data, what exactly, what's our data source, who's responsible for it, what is the timeline. And in this Google sheet, then it can be shared with multiple people. So it's not like I have my own data collection sheet, you have a collection sheet, and how do we put it all together? So there is the one that we created, and also in the folder that we shared with you, there's a sample from San Diego, which is much more, there's a lot more in that. So you can kind of see how maybe they worked out their different things. And it also has specific things to programs that they were running in San Diego. So if you look at, and you're like, what is that? It's some of it is specific to what's going on in San Diego. So we wanted to give you this option to have just as a tool. Okay. And Dan, I think you're next.
I did it. I forgot to unmute. Sorry. And then lastly, we just want to get back to the why, right? So Chris kind of set that up for us at the beginning. But really, this information is needed in order for you and your district to tell your story. And as we always say, if you don't tell your story, somebody else will. And so we want to encourage you to think about these 2 questions, really. How and for whom will you tell your story? And how and for whom will you communicate your results? So will this information eventually just be used to kind of report back out in your LCAP in whatever template that might look like? Is it information that you need to collect in order for presentation to your board? Is it information that's needed for communicating successes and challenges to your staff as you reflect upon last year's, just kind of what happened last year and how you're planning for moving forward, as well as will it be communicated out to your public, for example, via district-wide mailing? So those are all potential stories that need to be told to different populations, and we want to encourage you to think through how you will use this information to tell that story. And the visual here, kind of the graphic, is from Pajaro Valley Unified School District. And this was just what I thought was really an excellent example of how they pulled together all of these alternative metrics to really tell their families how they did during distance learning, how they communicated out the information, how students were logging on to devices and accessing the information. And so they were really able to paint that story for their stakeholders. So in these final minutes before we all have to jump off and get to our 2:30 call, just want to encourage you to think through that question: how will you share your story? And if there's 1 or 2 individuals out there that might have an idea or 2 that want to unmute or put it in the chat, please feel free to do so. So I'm not seeing anything yet. Maybe this is a big question for us all to think through, and one that can't be answered in 30 seconds. I see Kirsten said just the idea of an infographic is helpful about how we communicate this information out. And I know that that's something a lot of us have been thinking about. How do we translate kind of this complex data into an infographic that can be easily kind of comprehensible to our parents and families. So that's great. Feel free to reach out to any of us as you're thinking through that question. We're here to be your thought partners in that. If we can move forward to the next slide, Jess. We do have one final polling question for those of you who have stayed on to the bitter end here. So as we bring this conversation to a close today, just want to take a final moment to answer this question if you can. We are just curious that after today, what will be your next steps regarding alternative metrics? Are you going to just kind of maybe use and adapt some of these tools for some of the work that you already have going on in your district? Do you feel as though you need to take them back and maybe review them with a team and think through how you might be able to move through this idea of alternative metrics? Maybe you're in a position where you feel like you need to take it back and discuss with your superintendent or decision makers as to what steps you might be able to take as a district, or maybe you're just not sure, which is okay too. Sometimes I have to sleep on things for a night or two, so I can perfectly understand that as a question or as a response as well. So if you can just answer, I'll give you about 10 seconds. Jess, if you can put up the poll results. I don't know if everybody can see them. I don't see them yet. Oh, there they are. So 20% said they're going to begin or continue to use these tools. Most, about 47%, are going to take them back and hopefully review them with the team. And then another third feel like they need to kind of maybe touch base with the superintendent and some decision makers to see how they might be able to use that. So that's very helpful information for us. And as I noted before, we're here to help in any way that we can. So if you feel like you would like to just have some thought partnership about how you can take these next steps, we're definitely here to have that conversation. And we really hope this isn't the end, but really the beginning of this conversation as to how we measure the effectiveness of our systems and really think through those three questions we discussed up front about what's working, what's not working, and for whom. And with that, I'll turn it back over, I think, to Chris to close us out.
Yeah, Jess, if you could go to the next slide. So again, we just want to thank you for taking 90 minutes out of your day here. I'm sure it's been a whirlwind over the last few months, as it has been for us, but we don't even presume to understand all of the challenges that you're facing. But we do want you to know that we're here. I want to personally thank Deanne and Dan and Annie and Jess, the magician behind the scenes, who's doing all the breakout groups and trying to figure out how to make this work, for their work around this. But as a larger organization, our Equity and Educational Progress Division, the LCAP Advisory Services, and the District Support Division, we just want to be thought partners and support you in any way. And so as you think of things and they're relevant, they're probably relevant to other people as well. So please continue to reach out to us. Let us know how we can help. We hope to offer additional support and trainings moving forward through the summer. So take care. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.